Imagine being about to retire after a lifetime of danger and challenges, but on your last mission, you end up cornered in a dead-end alley with no way out and no help. That's exactly what happened to one police officer. But what he never expected was that his savior wouldn't be another police officer or a rescue operation, but a stray dog. This story will surprise you, because what happened next is more incredible than any training he ever had. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting stories like this one. Here, each video is a journey of overcoming and emotion that you won't want to miss. The rain had been falling all afternoon. Thick clouds hung low in the sky over São Paulo, casting a heavy gloom over the city. Inside the police precinct, João Almeida was going through his usual routine, paperwork. But there was something different today. It was his last day before retirement. After 23 years of service, João had seen it all: drug busts, shootouts, car chases, and countless dangerous situations. But even after all that time, there was one thing João had never gotten used to: the feeling of knowing the end was near. He stood up from his desk, adjusting his belt and making sure his weapon was securely fastened. A wave of nostalgia hit him as he glanced at the precinct one last time. His colleagues had gathered in the break room, chatting and laughing. Some of them were joking about his retirement, calling him old man and teasing him about taking up gardening. But João didn't join in the conversation. He had always been more reserved, focused on the job. He had no time for idle chatter. Not today, at least. "Almeida, you've got a call," the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. João grabbed the handset. "Go ahead. We've got a tip about a drug deal going down at Rua dos Três Irmãos. Possible weapons involved. No backup available, so it's all yours." João didn't hesitate. This was it, the last call. His heart raced slightly. It was a simple case, the kind of call he had dealt with 1,000 times. But this one felt different. There was something in the air tonight, something he couldn't quite place. "I'm on it," João responded, grabbing his jacket and heading for his patrol car. The rain had picked up as he drove through the streets, the wipers of his car struggling to keep up with the downpour. The roads were empty. The city, usually buzzing with life at this hour, was eerily quiet. João couldn't help but think how strange it was to be heading into his final mission, alone, after all these years. As he reached Rua dos Três Irmãos, he slowed down. The street was dark, with few lights, and the shadows from the surrounding buildings made it look even more deserted than usual. João pulled over, parking his car near the end of the alley. He grabbed his flashlight and checked his weapon one last time. He had been through hundreds of similar situations, stakeouts, raids, and arrests, but tonight felt different. The silence was almost suffocating. João didn't know it yet, but his intuition was right. This was no ordinary call. As he made his way down the alley, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His training kicked in, and he moved carefully, keeping close to the walls, his footsteps muffled by the rain-soaked pavement. Just ahead, he saw a figure in the shadows. It was a man, standing still, as if waiting for something. João instinctively reached for his radio, but before he could press the button, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. His heart skipped a beat. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the rain. "Must be the wind," João muttered to himself, but the unease in his gut wouldn't go away. He took a few more steps, his flashlight cutting through the dark. That's when he saw them, 3 men, emerging from the shadows, armed and ready. "Well, well, well. What do we have here?" one of them said, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he brandished a pistol. João froze. The adrenaline shot through his veins as the 3 men closed in on him. The 3 men moved closer, their footsteps echoing in the alley like the sound of a ticking clock. Joao's heart pounded in his chest. He had faced countless criminals in his career, but there was something about this moment that felt different. The air felt thick, charged, as if the very walls of the narrow alley were closing in on him. One of the men, the tallest and most imposing of the trio, took a step forward. His eyes glinted with malice, and the gun in his hand glimmered under the dim streetlight. Joao instinctively reached for his own sidearm, but he knew he was outnumbered. "You're in the wrong place, officer," the man sneered. "You should have stayed home tonight." Joao's mind raced. He couldn't afford to make a wrong move. His training had taught him to stay calm in situations like this, but it was hard to keep his focus when everything seemed to be spinning around him. "I don't want any trouble," Joao said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "You don't have to do this. Just walk away." The second man, shorter but stockier, let out a harsh laugh. "Walk away? What do you think this is, a game? You're alone here, and we don't plan on leaving until you're finished." He took a few steps forward, his eyes scanning Joao's every move. The third man, a younger one with a scar running down his cheek, pointed his gun at Joao's chest, his finger twitching as if itching to pull the trigger. "Let's make this quick," "Yeah," the scarred man said coldly. "No need for a lot of noise." Joao's mind raced as he weighed his options. He was surrounded, with no backup in sight. His radio was tucked away, out of reach, and the alleyway was too narrow to try running. But he was trained for moments like these. His focus sharpened. He kept his hands raised, slowly inching them toward his holster. His voice was calm as he spoke again. "I'm just doing my job. You don't want to make this worse." The tall man, who seemed to be in charge, shook his head. "We already have. You should have stayed out of this, old man." The tension was unbearable. Joao's hand was now just inches from his gun, but he knew any sudden movement would be met with a deadly response. As his fingers brushed the grip of his weapon, something unexpected happened. A loud, furious bark cut through the night air. The three men froze, momentarily distracted by the noise. Joao's eyes darted around the alley, trying to figure out what had caused the disruption. The men looked confused, but Joao could see the faint outline of something moving in the shadows. Before any of the men could react, a scruffy dog appeared from the darkness of the alleyway, fur matted from the rain. It wasn't large, but it was clearly enraged, teeth bared as it charged toward the group, barking relentlessly. "Get that dog out of here," one of the men shouted, stepping back. The dog didn't listen. It continued to bark aggressively, circling around the men, as if sensing the danger Joao was in. Joao's heart skipped a beat. Could this be his chance? The tall man raised his gun, aiming at the dog. "You want to die too, mutt?" he growled, but the dog was too quick. It darted between the men, growling and snapping at their ankles. Joao seized the moment. In one swift movement, he grabbed his gun and aimed it at the leader of the group. "I said, no trouble," he shouted, his voice now commanding. The three men hesitated, distracted by the dog's relentless barking and aggressive movements. Joao's finger tightened on the trigger, ready to defend himself if necessary. He couldn't take any chances. But just as the tension was about to explode, the dog turned and sprinted toward the street, continuing its loud, frantic barking. Joao quickly turned to the men, his weapon still aimed at them. "Back off," he warned, his voice steady but filled with authority. The trio glanced at each other, uncertain. They were outmatched and out of their element. The dog's sudden appearance had thrown them off guard, and now Joao had the upper hand. But just as they started to retreat, something strange happened. The dog stopped at the mouth of the alley, turned around, and began barking even louder. It was as if it was trying to communicate something. "Go after it," the tall man shouted, but before they could make a move, the dog bolted down the street. In a split second, Joao realized what the dog was doing. It wasn't just barking aimlessly. It was trying to lead someone who could help. With the criminals distracted and retreating into the shadows, João made his move, staying low as he cautiously backed away toward the street, following the dog's path. João's heart pounded as the dog ran down the street, barking wildly. For a brief moment, he was frozen. Was the dog just acting on instinct, or was it trying to lead someone to help? The three criminals seemed unsure of what to do. The tall man, still holding his gun, glared down the street at the dog, his face twisted in frustration. "Forget the damn dog," he muttered. "Let's just finish this." But João didn't wait around to find out what their next move would be. His instincts kicked in, and he began to back away, his eyes never leaving the group. He had to be smart about this. There was no way he'd make it out alive if he kept facing them directly. He needed help, and fast. The alley seemed to stretch endlessly before him. His mind raced as he turned the corner, hoping the streetlight ahead would offer some visibility. He couldn't see the dog anymore, but he could still hear its frantic barking. And then, suddenly, something in the distance caught his attention. A pair of headlights appeared at the end of the street, cutting through the dark. João squinted, trying to focus through the rain. It was a police car, a patrol vehicle, slowing down as it approached the intersection. The dog hadn't just been barking for no reason. It had led them straight to him. In that instant, João knew what he had to do. He quickly ducked into a doorway, pressing himself against the cold brick wall of a nearby building. His hand instinctively went to his radio, but the connection was static-filled and unreliable. He glanced back toward the alley, but the criminals were nowhere in sight, still hidden in the shadows. He hoped they hadn't seen the patrol car yet. The police car approached slowly, its tires skimming the wet asphalt. The dog, still barking, stood at the corner of the street, blocking the path. João didn't move a muscle. The patrol car slowed even further as the dog continued its furious barking. The officers inside seemed puzzled, but they didn't hesitate. The car stopped directly in front of the animal, and the door opened. "What's going on here?" one of the officers said, stepping out and looking down at the dog. His partner followed close behind, hands on his weapon, scanning the street. The dog stopped barking for a moment, tail wagging slightly, and then darted toward the alley. It was almost as if it was signaling for them to follow. João's breath caught in his chest. "It's working," he thought. "They're here." The two officers exchanged confused glances, but then they followed the dog without a second thought. The creature, still on alert, led them straight toward the alley where João had been cornered. His body tensed, his senses sharp. He had to stay hidden for just a little longer. Minutes passed in what felt like an eternity. The dog's barking grew louder again as it neared the alley's entrance. João could hear the officers talking now, low voices, trying to figure out what was happening. And then, out of the darkness, the men appeared. They had regrouped. The tall one was in the lead, now holding a pistol in one hand and a knife in the other. His eyes darted toward the patrol car, and for a moment, he hesitated. "Get rid of the cops, fast," he ordered the others, his voice low and sharp. João's stomach dropped. This was it. The criminals had spotted the backup, and they were getting ready to strike. The officers were in immediate danger, and João knew they had no idea what they were walking into. Before they could act, the dog charged toward them again, its barking now a desperate crescendo. The officers reacted instantly. One of them raised his firearm, and the other reached for his radio, signaling for backup. But the tall man reacted faster than João had hoped. He raised his gun and fired a shot into the air, the sound deafening in the quiet night. "Get down!" João shouted instinctively. He didn't have time to think, just to act. Without another second of hesitation, João ran toward the street, his gun raised. He had to make sure the officers weren't blindsided. The criminals turned toward him just as he reached the open street, forcing them to choose between him and the officers. The alley was filled with tension, the sound of the dog's frantic barking echoing in the distance, but João didn't flinch. This was his moment. "Drop the weapons!" João yelled, his voice loud enough to carry through the rain and the chaos. The three men exchanged glances. The tall man's grip tightened around his gun, but he didn't fire. It was a standoff, and João knew that if he didn't act quickly, they would take down the officers. For a few long seconds, no one moved. Then, the younger man with the scar on his cheek took a step forward, his eyes narrowed. "You really think you can take us all on, cop?" João's fingers tightened on his own weapon, his eyes scanning the three criminals. He was ready. He had no choice but to be. But before he could respond, a sound broke the tension. It wasn't the dogs barking anymore. It was the sound of a second patrol car, arriving faster than he expected. The screech of tires echoed down the street, and João's eyes darted toward the second patrol car as it skidded to a stop just behind the first one. The officers inside didn't hesitate, they quickly stepped out, guns drawn and scanning the surroundings. The arrival of backup was a relief, but João knew the danger wasn't over yet. In fact, things were about to get even more intense. The three criminals, now surrounded by four armed police officers, stood frozen for a moment, their eyes shifting between João and the new arrivals. The tension in the alley was suffocating. The rain continued to pour, and the sound of water dripping from the rooftops filled the heavy silence. "Drop your weapons," one of the new officers shouted, his voice firm and commanding. The tall man, still holding his gun, looked over his shoulder at his two companions. The scarred man seemed to hesitate, but the younger one with the knife raised his chin defiantly, unwilling to show fear. It was clear they weren't going down without a fight. The tall man, finally breaking the silence, sneered. "You really think you've got us cornered, huh? You think you can just walk in here and take us down?" He looked over at his men, who slowly adjusted their stances, as if preparing for an attack. "Don't move," João said, his voice cold and steady. He had seen standoffs like this before, but this was different. His whole body was on edge. These men weren't just criminals, they were desperate. And desperate people would do anything. Before João could say another word, the tall man made a sudden move. He lunged forward, aiming his gun directly at one of the officers who had just arrived. "Down!" João shouted, diving toward the officer. But the shot rang out before he could make it. Everything seemed to slow down in that split second, the sound of the gunshot, the flash of light from the muzzle, the movement of the officers as they scrambled to react. The bullet missed the officer, but only by inches. It grazed the edge of his jacket, leaving a deep tear. In that instant, chaos erupted. The scarred man and the younger one with the knife rushed toward the officers, trying to gain an advantage. The officer who had been fired upon immediately fired back, hitting the younger man in the shoulder. The man stumbled back, howling in pain, but his hand still gripped the knife, raised threateningly. "Get down," the officer barked, but the fight was already spiraling out of control. The sound of gunshots filled the air, and the alley became a battlefield. João quickly took cover behind a dumpster, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He scanned the scene, watching as the officers returned fire, trying to subdue the criminals without causing fatal harm. The rain seemed to get heavier, the sound of gunfire echoing in the midst of the storm. The dog, still barking from the far end of the street, suddenly ran back into the alley, leaping between the officers and the criminals, its fur wet and matted from the rain. It was as if the dog was trying to get in the middle of the fight, as if it knew exactly what was happening. "Get that damn dog out of here," one of the criminals shouted, his voice panicked as he tried to regain control of the situation. But the dog wasn't backing down. It dashed forward, biting at the heels of the scarred man, who howled and kicked out in frustration. The dog's actions were frantic, but they were also calculated, as if it was trying to buy time for João and the officers. In that moment, João saw his opening. With the criminals distracted by the dog, the officers had a brief window of time to subdue them. João, moving swiftly, pushed off from the dumpster and aimed his gun at the tall man, who was still trying to reload his weapon. "Drop it," João ordered, his voice sharp and full of authority. The tall man looked at João, his eyes wild with fear and rage, but he didn't lower the gun. Instead, he lunged forward, trying to break free from João's line of sight. But before he could pull the trigger, the second officer fired a shot, hitting the man in the leg. He collapsed to the ground, his gun skittering away across the wet pavement. The remaining two criminals, realizing their plan had crumbled, began to retreat. But the officers closed in quickly. One officer tackled the scarred man, knocking him to the ground, while the other moved to disarm the younger man, who was still clutching his knife. "Freeze! Don't move," the officer shouted, holding the criminal at gunpoint. João, breathing heavily, looked around at the scene. The dog, finally realizing the fight was over, stopped barking and trotted toward João, tail wagging. It had been the unexpected hero in this chaotic mess. The rain continued to pour, and the alley, now eerily silent except for the sound of the officers securing the criminals, felt like a world apart from everything João had ever known. "Nice work, old man," one of the officers said, breathing heavily as he looked at João. "And your four-legged friend here, definitely saved our asses." João smiled faintly, looking down at the dog, who had now settled at his feet, panting but calm. It was hard to believe that such a small, scruffy animal had been the key to their survival. "Guess it's not always just the people who make the difference," João said, his voice hoarse but grateful. The rain hadn't let up, but now it seemed to carry a different weight, a kind of relief, washing away the tension that had filled the alley just moments before. The criminals were subdued, cuffed, and sitting on the wet pavement, while the officers moved quickly to process the scene. João stood at the edge of the alley, still catching his breath. His pulse had slowed, but his mind was still racing, replaying the moments of chaos in his head. He glanced over at the dog, who was now sitting at his feet, looking up at him with wide, soulful eyes, as if expecting something more. One of the officers, a young man with a neatly trimmed beard, approached João with a faint smile. "You okay, Almeida?" he asked, still a little out of breath. João nodded slowly, his hand brushing over his face. "I'm fine. Just glad the backup got here in time." "Backup and a lucky break," the officer said, looking over at the dog, who had stopped barking and was now calmly sniffing the ground. "That mutt did more than any of us, that's for sure." João chuckled softly, glancing down at the scruffy animal. "Yeah, didn't expect a dog to be the hero of the night." The officer crouched down, extending a hand toward the dog. "I'll bet he's hungry, though," he said. The dog, however, didn't move. It just sat there, watching them. After a few moments, it let out a soft whine, as if to acknowledge the officer's presence, but it didn't approach. João smiled faintly. He'd seen plenty of stray dogs in his time, especially in the neighborhoods he worked in. But this one, it felt different. There was a sense of purpose in its eyes, as if it knew exactly what had just transpired. The officers finished securing the criminals, one of them heading off to call for the transport unit. João, still standing at the alley's mouth, felt a strange sense of connection with the dog. The way it had acted tonight, as if it had been on a mission of its own. It was almost like the dog had known he needed help before he even realized it himself. "You sure you're all right, Almeida?" the officer asked again, snapping João back to reality. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm good," João replied, his voice firm again. Just thinking." He shifted his stance, looking down at the dog once more. "What's your name, huh?" he muttered to it. Are you someone's pet? Or just a stray who decided to do something good for once? The dog's eyes locked onto Joao's. It tilted its head, its ears perked up slightly, as if understanding the question. But it didn't give any obvious sign of recognition. It was just a street dog, a creature of habit, and yet tonight it had chosen to act differently. The young officer, who had been watching the exchange, leaned over and whispered to Joao, "You think he's trained? Like, some kind of working dog or something?" Joao shook his head. "No way. Look at him, just a regular street dog, trying to survive. But tonight he saved our asses." Just then, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. The backup transport unit was on its way to take the criminals into custody. The officers began to finish up their paperwork and prepare for the next steps. But Joao wasn't quite ready to leave yet. The dog had done something no one had expected, something that had changed the entire course of the night. And even though he wasn't the kind of man to dwell on the little things, something about the dog's presence felt important. Before he could say anything else, one of the officers approached again, this time holding a small plastic bag of dog food. "We found this in one of the patrol cars," the officer said. "I figured if you're gonna stick around, you might want to feed the guy. Looks like he's been through a lot tonight too." Joao took the bag and knelt down, gently shaking the food into a pile on the wet ground. The dog sniffed the air, its tail wagging slightly, before it cautiously stepped forward. It didn't devour the food right away, though. Instead, it took a few small bites, looking up at Joao as if waiting for something. "Good boy," Joao murmured, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You really are something else." As he stood up, he felt a sense of something deep within him. This wasn't just about the adrenaline, the near-death experience, or the criminals they had captured. It was about the strange bond between him and this dog, a bond forged not through words, but through action. "Where's he gonna go now?" the officer asked, watching the dog finish the food. Joao hesitated, his mind racing. "I don't know. Maybe back to the streets, like he's used to." The dog finished eating and took a few more steps toward Joao, nuzzling against his leg, as if seeking affection. Joao's heart softened at the gesture. Despite everything, the dog had shown loyalty and courage when it mattered most. Maybe it was more than just a stray after all. "Maybe I'll take him with me," Joao said softly, looking down at the animal. "I'll take him to the shelter tomorrow. Find him a better life than this." The officer smiled. "Good luck with that. Looks like you two make quite the team." Joao nodded, a quiet feeling of peace settling over him. The night had been long, dangerous, and filled with chaos, but there was something about this moment, the rain, the calm after the storm, that made everything feel just a little bit right. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. And as he walked back toward his car, the dog trotting beside him, Joao realized that maybe this wasn't the end of something. Maybe it was just the beginning of something unexpected, something that would shape the next chapter of his life. Joao sat in the driver's seat of his patrol car, the engine idling softly in the heavy rain. The dog was lying on the floor of the passenger side, its eyes half closed, exhausted but calm. It had taken a few moments to settle into the car, and even now, it kept glancing at Joao as if expecting something. Joao's thoughts were a whirlwind. His entire career had been filled with routine and risk, with constant vigilance and calculated decisions. But tonight had been different. The adrenaline had faded, and now, as he drove through the wet streets of São Paulo, it was the quiet aftermath that lingered in his mind. The dog. It was an odd feeling, having the animal there with him. A street dog, no less. Joao had seen so many like it over the years, dogs that ran through the streets, hungry, abandoned, and barely surviving. But this one had done something he'd never expected. It had shown courage, instinct, and a kind of loyalty that Joao hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just a stray, it was a symbol of something bigger, something that had drawn him in. As he drove through the darkened streets, Joao's phone buzzed in his pocket. He took his eyes off the road for a split second, enough to pull it out and glance at the screen. It was a message from his colleague, Officer Silva. "Good job tonight, Joao. Glad you're okay. Enjoy your last day tomorrow. You earned it." Joao smiled faintly, but there was no excitement in the thought of his retirement. He'd been counting down the days for years, but now that it was almost here, the thought of leaving it all behind felt strangely hollow. After so many years of work, of risking his life, of making decisions that meant life or death, he wasn't sure what life after the badge would look like. But as he glanced over at the dog, now curled up on the seat, its head resting on its paws, he felt a strange sense of comfort. The dog didn't know about his career, his struggles, or his looming retirement. It didn't care about the badge or the past, it just cared about the moment, about the simple act of being there. He pulled the car to a stop at a red light, his gaze drifting back to the dog. The animal's fur was still damp, its coat matted and dirty from the rain, but there was a calmness to it now. Its breathing had slowed, and it seemed content for the first time in hours. Joao hesitated for a moment before reaching over and gently petting the dog's head. The dog didn't flinch or pull away. It just looked up at him, its eyes warm and trusting. Joao's heart clenched in his chest. He hadn't felt this needed in a long time. "Guess you're stuck with me now, huh?" Joao murmured, more to himself than to the dog. He wasn't sure why he felt so connected to it. Maybe it was because the dog had done what he himself had always done, fought for survival, even when the odds were stacked against it. The light turned green, and Joao drove on, slowly making his way through the rain-slick streets. The city seemed quieter now, almost deserted, as if the storm had chased everyone inside. He turned the corner, heading toward his small apartment, the familiar, comforting sights of home in the distance. But as he pulled up to the curb in front of his building, Joao suddenly felt a pang of uncertainty. He had never been the type to take in animals, especially not stray dogs. His life had always been chaotic, full of danger, and he'd never had the time to take care of something that wasn't his responsibility. But tonight had changed everything. The dog had saved his life, and it had become more than just a witness to his last mission, it had become a part of his story. The question was now, what would happen next? He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, staring out the windshield. The rain was still coming down, but the streets were quiet now. The dog lifted its head again, sensing Joao's hesitation. "All right," Joao sighed, unlocking the door. "You're coming with me. Just for tonight." The dog didn't need any further encouragement. As soon as the door opened, it bounded out, tail wagging, eager to follow Joao inside. He couldn't help but smile, despite the weight of his thoughts. Inside his apartment, Joao set down his keys and removed his jacket, still processing everything that had happened. His small place was neat but sparse, a single bedroom, a modest kitchen, and a few old pieces of furniture. It was the kind of space that reflected the life he had led for the past few decades, functional, efficient, and quiet. But tonight, it felt different. As he looked down at the dog, sitting patiently by the door, he realized just how much the presence of another living creature changed the atmosphere of the room. The emptiness that had always been so familiar to him felt a little less heavy now. "Guess you want something to eat," Joao muttered, opening the cupboard and pulling out a can of tuna. It wasn't the healthiest choice, but it was all he had at the moment. He opened the can and set it down in a bowl. The dog sniffed the tuna for a moment, but then it paused, looking up at Joao again. Its eyes were wide and searching, as if it were trying to tell him something. Joao tilted his head. "What is it? You don't like tuna?" The dog simply nudged the bowl with its nose, then returned to watching him, tail wagging slowly. Joao chuckled softly, feeling a small sense of amusement. All right. I'll get you something else." As he rummaged through the fridge, trying to figure out what he could offer, he found himself wondering if taking this dog in was the right decision. But deep down, he already knew the answer. The dog had chosen him tonight, just as much as he had chosen to help it. It wasn't just some stray, it was a companion. And in a way, it had saved him, too, reminded him that even in the hardest times, there was still room for loyalty, for connection. João made a mental note to take the dog to a vet the next day, to check for any injuries, to see if it had a collar, a microchip, anything. But for now, he was content with just the quiet company. The chaos of the night had passed, and in its place was a strange sense of peace. As he fed the dog a more suitable meal, João sat back on the couch, finally allowing himself to relax. "Guess this retirement thing can wait a little longer," he muttered to himself, looking down at the dog, who was now happily eating. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, João didn't feel so alone. The days that followed felt strangely different for João. His retirement, which had once seemed like a distant, inevitable future, now loomed closer with each passing hour. But it wasn't the paperwork or the final goodbyes that occupied his thoughts. It was the dog. The street dog, who had suddenly become a constant presence in his life, and whose quiet companionship had turned his solitary apartment into something more. João hadn't expected to feel this way. After years of being a cop, a career defined by isolation and danger, he was used to being alone. Even in the crowded precinct, he'd often felt distant from his colleagues. Relationships had been difficult for him, he had seen too much, experienced too many close calls, too many moments where he'd had to shut himself off from others to stay sane. But this dog, it was different. Every day since that night, the dog had been by his side. It followed him from room to room, sitting quietly while João watched TV or drank his coffee. Sometimes, the dog would nudge João with its nose, asking for attention, and João would smile, giving in without a second thought. In the mornings, when João got up to make breakfast, the dog would sit by the door, tail wagging. It seemed to be waiting for something, always alert, but also completely at ease with João's presence. He had named the dog Max, after a long-forgotten family dog from his childhood. The name felt right, like it belonged to him. But there were still things João didn't know. Where had Max come from? Had he been abandoned, or was he simply a stray who had wandered too far? João had tried to ask around the neighborhood, but no one seemed to recognize the dog. There was no collar, no sign of ownership, nothing that would explain how Max had ended up in that alley, barking his way into João's life. One morning, as João was having his coffee, Max jumped up beside him, resting his head on João's lap. João gently scratched behind his ears, feeling a sense of warmth spread through him. The quiet moments, the simple routine of caring for the dog, were starting to grow on him. "You know," João said softly, looking down at Max, "I was never good with things like this. I've spent so much time working, chasing criminals, dealing with the worst of humanity, that I never really stopped to think about, well, anything else." Max perked up at the sound of his name, but didn't move. He seemed to understand. "I've been thinking about the future," João continued, his voice low. "Retirement. I don't know if I'm ready for it. I thought I'd just pack up and walk away, leave the badge behind. But I don't know anymore. It feels different now. With you here, it feels like there's still something worth sticking around for." Max, as if responding to João's words, gave a soft huff and settled further into João's lap. His presence was reassuring, his loyalty undeniable. For the first time in a long time, João felt like maybe he wasn't alone in this world, that perhaps he hadn't been as abandoned as he'd thought. The days stretched into a routine that João hadn't known he needed. He'd take Max on long walks through the park, letting him explore the familiar streets and corners that João had passed 1,000 times without thinking. They would stop at a café near João's apartment, where he'd get a coffee and share bits of pastry with Max, who was always happy to sit beside him. It was a life João had never imagined, a simple life, a peaceful one, and yet it felt so foreign to him. He had never truly allowed himself to feel comfortable, never let his guard down for long enough to enjoy these little things. But Max had a way of making him feel like it was okay to just breathe. One afternoon, João decided to take Max to the local shelter. He needed to know more about the dog, whether it had a history, a family. Maybe there was someone out there who had been looking for him. The shelter was just a short walk from João's apartment. The building was small and well-kept, and inside, there were rows of cages with dogs of all shapes and sizes. As João and Max walked through the aisles, he saw people interacting with the dogs, offering treats, playing, and even adopting. But Max didn't seem interested in any of them. He stayed close to João, his eyes focused on him, tail wagging lightly. A volunteer approached them, a woman with a warm smile. "Hi there. How can I help you today?" "I was hoping you could tell me a little more about this dog," João said, motioning to Max. "I found him a few days ago, but I don't know much about him. Is he from around here?" The woman looked at Max for a moment, then leaned down to give him a pat. He's a handsome one. I don't think he's one of ours, but, you never know. We get a lot of strays around here." João felt a pang of uncertainty in his chest. He'd hoped for some clue, some trace of where Max had come from, but there was nothing. "Has anyone been looking for him?" João asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman shook her head. "Not that I know of. If he's a stray, he might have wandered off from somewhere else, or he might have just been abandoned. But he looks like he's been through a lot. He might have had an owner at some point, but no one's reported him missing." João nodded, his mind swirling with thoughts. He glanced down at Max, who was now sitting calmly at his feet, looking up at him with those same trusting eyes. It didn't matter, João realized. Whether Max had a past or not, he was here now, and so was João. Maybe that was all that mattered. "Thanks," João said, standing up. "I think he's good where he is. With me." The woman smiled. "Well, if you decide to adopt him officially, we can help with that. We'd be happy to assist." João gave her a grateful nod. "I'll think about it." As they walked out of the shelter and back onto the street, Max trotted happily beside João, as if nothing in the world had changed. And maybe it hadn't. João still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to figure it all out. Max had given him something he hadn't realized he'd been missing, a reason to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The days following João's visit to the shelter were some of the most peaceful he had experienced in years. His retirement was official now, the badge was handed in, his desk cleared, and the precinct was just a memory. But for the first time in his life, João didn't feel the heavy weight of finality or loss that he had expected. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of freedom, a breath of fresh air that he hadn't realized he'd been holding in for so long. Max, the dog who had come into his life as an unexpected hero, was now a constant companion. They woke up each morning together, with Max nudging João's hand, eager for breakfast and the start of their daily routine. João had slowly grown accustomed to the rhythm of this new life. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't the adrenaline-pumping days of patrols or high-stakes arrests. But it was real. And for João, that made all the difference. One of the first things João did after his retirement was take Max on long walks through the city. They walked along the familiar streets that João had once patrolled, but now they felt different. The crowds of people, the noise of the traffic, it didn't bother him the way it used to. Instead, he found himself noticing things he'd never paid attention to before, the small cafe where he had his coffee each morning, the corner store with the old man who always waved, the park bench where he and Max sat on sunny afternoons, watching the world go by. Life had slowed down, but in the best way possible. On a sunny afternoon, João sat on the park bench, the one near the fountain, with Max at his side. It was a quiet spot, one that João had always passed by but never stopped at during his years on the force. Now, he found solace in the stillness. People walked past, oblivious to the man on the bench with the street dog beside him, but for João, it felt like he had everything he needed. A small child ran past them, laughing as the fountain's water sprayed into the air. João couldn't help but smile. Max, ever the watchful guardian, sat up straighter, his ears perked at the sound of the child's laughter. João rubbed the back of Max's neck, his fingers sinking into the thick fur. "You know, I never thought this would be my life," João said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Max turned his head and met João's gaze with those deep, knowing eyes. Retirement, a dog, a park bench. It wasn't part of the plan. But somehow, it feels right. Max gave a soft huff, as if agreeing, and rested his head on João's knee. João let out a long breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. This was his new reality, one that he had never planned for, but one that was now more fulfilling than any mission or arrest had ever been. That evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned orange and pink, João sat on his small balcony, sipping a beer. Max was curled up at his feet, content after their long walk. João looked out over the city, thinking about everything that had led him here. He had been a cop for over 2 decades, serving his city, facing danger head-on. But the truth was, he'd always felt like an outsider. He'd always kept himself at arm's length, knowing that at any moment, his career could take another dark turn. He had never allowed himself to relax, to take in the beauty of life without the constant threat of violence or chaos. And yet, now, as he watched the city lights flicker on in the distance, he realized that maybe he hadn't truly been living before. Maybe he had been surviving, just going through the motions, always waiting for the next call or the next danger to come. But with Max, everything had changed. The dog had reminded him of something important, that life wasn't just about the work, the badge, or the sacrifices. It was about moments like these. Quiet evenings. Simple companionship. The freedom to just exist without the weight of the past. João smiled as Max rolled onto his back, paws in the air, wanting a belly rub. He laughed softly and leaned down, giving the dog a gentle scratch. "You're a good boy, Max," he murmured, his heart full. "You saved me more than you'll ever know." Max looked up at him, eyes filled with trust, as if he understood every word. João felt something stir inside him, a warmth he hadn't realized was missing, something deeper than gratitude. It was connection. It was love, of the simplest and purest kind. The kind that didn't need to be earned or explained. The doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. João stood up, giving Max one last scratch before going to answer it. When he opened the door, he was greeted by Officer Silva, his old colleague from the precinct. Silva had come by to check on João, to see how he was settling into retirement. Well, look at you," Silva said, grinning as he stepped inside. "Living the good life, huh? How's it feel?" João chuckled, stepping aside to let Silva in. "It's different," he said, glancing back at Max, who was now sitting by the door, wagging his tail at the new arrival. "But I think I'm getting the hang of it." Silva glanced at the dog, raising an eyebrow. "So, you kept him, huh?" João nodded. "Yeah. I guess he's part of the family now." "Good for you, João. You deserve some peace after all those years." They sat down on the couch, catching up on old times, and as Silva told stories about life back at the precinct, João realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't longing for the chaos. He wasn't yearning for the action. He had found his own peace. And he had found it in the most unexpected way, through a dog who had wandered into his life, just when he needed it most. The night stretched on, filled with laughter and conversation, the city lights flickering softly outside. But in Joao's heart, he knew one thing for sure: retirement had not come at the cost of everything he had known. It had opened the door to something new. A new life, with a new companion by his side, and a new beginning. For the first time in years, Joao felt ready to face whatever came next. If you liked this story and want more content like this, leave a like, share it with someone you know will be moved by it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore inspiring stories and moments that touch the heart. Until the next video.